The palace stood tall, with shining walls that had seen many years of power. Inside, the great hall was filled with nobles, guards, and servants. They had gathered to welcome back the explorers who had traveled far beyond the skies. It was not just a return but a celebration, and everyone wanted to hear the stories of what they had faced. Among the group of explorers stood Daniel. He was not dressed in fine clothes, nor did he carry the pride of a noble. His clothes were simple, his hands marked by work, and his face calm. Yet when he stood in that hall, people noticed him. There was something in his eyes that showed strength and truth. The Queen herself, Eleanor, watched him closely. The explorers were asked to speak of their journey. Many told of the storms in space, the endless nights, and the dangers of worlds unknown. Some bragged of their bravery, while others spoke with fear. When it was Daniel's turn, he did not speak with boast or show. He told the court about the nights when men lost hope, the hours when food was gone, and the moments when only courage kept them alive. His words were not loud, but they carried weight. He spoke of how his friends had fallen ill, and how he cared for them until they stood again. Spoke of times when they faced fire and storms, when many thought they would die, but they pushed forward. He did not call himself a hero, only said that when others needed him, he could not walk away. The hall grew quiet as he spoke, and even those who first ignored him began to listen. Queen Eleanor leaned forward in her seat, her eyes fixed on him. She had heard many men speak, but none spoke like Daniel. He did not try to win her favor. He did not try to prove he was greater than others. He only spoke the truth, and the truth had power. She felt something stir in her heart, something she had not felt in many years of hearing empty words from nobles. The nobles whispered among themselves. They looked at Daniel with suspicion. How could a man with no title, no crown, no land, speak in a way that moved the queen? Some frowned, some laughed quietly, but they could not deny the silence that filled the hall as he spoke. The queen raised her hand, and all voices died down. She asked Daniel one question. What gave you the strength to keep moving forward when all was lost? Daniel looked at her, his eyes steady. It was the thought that, if we gave up, no one would return home. I could not let that happen. Hope is not given by gold or crowns. Hope comes when a man refuses to fall, even when the night is darkest. The hall was silent again. The queen did not answer at once. She sat back on her throne, but her mind did not rest. She thought about her lords, men who spoke of power but feared loss. She thought of her suitors, men who came to her only for her crown. Then she thought of Daniel, who had no reason to impress her, yet had spoken words that reached her heart. The feast went on, but her thoughts stayed with him. Daniel returned to his seat among the explorers, unaware of the storm he had begun. The queen's eyes followed him more than once, and her advisors noticed. Some grew uneasy, others angry. A commoner should not hold the queen's attention, they thought. Yet none could deny that the hall had fallen silent for him, and his words still echoed in their minds. As the night came to an end, Queen Eleanor rose. She gave thanks to the explorers for their service, and she promised rewards for their courage. But her voice was strong, but when her eyes moved toward Daniel, it softened in a way no one missed. She left the hall, her thoughts heavy, while the court whispered louder than ever. Something had begun, though no one yet knew where it would lead. The days after the feast were filled with noise inside the palace. Nobles met in small groups, speaking in low voices about what had happened. They could not forget the way Queen Eleanor looked at Daniel. To them, it was dangerous for a ruler to give attention to a man with no title. They feared what it might mean for their own power. Whispers turned into rumors, and soon the whole palace was alive with talk about Daniel. Daniel himself returned to a quiet life. He did not seek the queen's attention. He stayed in the quarters given to the explorers, spending time with his friends and helping the wounded who had still not fully healed from the long journey. But even as he tried to remain unseen, guards and advisors kept their eyes on him. Every step he took inside the palace grounds was watched. Every word he spoke was carried back to those who wished to use it against him. One morning a messenger came to him. The queen had sent for him. Daniel followed without hesitation. He was led through high doors into a smaller chamber far from the great hall. It was a private place, with tall windows that looked out over the gardens. Queen Eleanor was already there, waiting. She dismissed her attendants so that only the two of them remained. She asked him about his life before the voyage. Daniel told her of his childhood, of simple days working on the land with his family. He spoke of hardship and loss, of how he had joined the explorers not for glory, but because he wanted to see more of the world than just fields and farms. He spoke honestly, not shaping his words to please her. The Queen listened, asking him questions. Her face calm, but her eyes sharp. Eleanor then asked him what he dreamed of now, after all he had seen. Daniel thought for a long moment before answering. He said he dreamed of a life where men and women could be valued for who they were, not for their name or their wealth. He said he wanted a place where a man could serve with honor and not be looked down upon for his birth. His words were simple, but they struck deep inside her. The Queen had heard many dreams from nobles. Most spoke of power, gold, or victory. Daniel spoke of fairness, of worth, of a kingdom where people stood by what they did rather than where they came from. She felt his words pull at her heart, though she kept her face steady. For a while they sat in silence. Aside, the sound of the wind moved through the garden trees. Then Eleanor said softly, "Do you know that many here do not want me to speak with you?" Daniel nodded. "I can see it in their eyes, but I am not here to take from them. I only speak because you ask." She studied him for a long moment. "They think you are dangerous." "I am only a man," Daniel replied. "Perhaps truth is always dangerous in a hall of power." His answer made her smile faintly. She found herself liking his courage, the way he spoke without fear, though he knew the whole court watched him. She had seen noblemen tremble before her throne, yet this man stood calm before her without crown or army. As the days turned into weeks, she called for him more often. Sometimes they walked in the gardens, speaking of the stars and the future of the kingdom. Sometimes they sat in the library, where he asked questions about books he had never read before. Daniel's curiosity surprised her, and she found herself enjoying his presence more than she had expected. But the palace was not blind. Advisors pressed her daily, warning her to stop. They said her honor and her throne would be threatened if she'd let a commoner stay close. Some nobles began to spread lies about Daniel, calling him proud and dangerous, yet Eleanor did not send him away. Instead, she began to see more clearly the division in her palace, the line between those who clung to power and those who wished for change. Daniel did not seek to rise, but his presence made others fear. And in that fear, the Queen began to see her path more clearly. For the first time, she wondered if the crown on her head had kept her blind to the kind of truth that Daniel carried in his heart. And though she did not yet speak it aloud, she knew her life was no longer the same since the day he first stood in the great hall and spoke of hope. The night of the grand feast came, and the palace glittered with light and music. Long tables were filled with food, and noblemen from across the kingdom gathered to honor the Queen. They wore jewels and fine robes, each hoping to catch her eye or gain her favor. But in the middle of that bright hall, Daniel sat quietly among the explorers, dressed as simply as always. The Queen entered, and all stood. Eleanor moved with grace, her crown shining under the great chandeliers. She took her throne, her face calm, yet her eyes moved across the hall until they found Daniel. That single glance did not go unnoticed. Whispers began again, moving like a shadow through the crowd. As the feast went on, the nobles drank and spoke loudly. Some told tales of their victories, others laughed at their own jokes. Yet Daniel spoke little, listening more than he talked. When asked about his journey, he spoke plainly, without boast. His words were few, but they carried truth, and once again, many in the hall grew quiet as they listened. One lord, a proud man with lands and wealth, grew angry at the silence Daniel created. He stood and mocked Daniel, calling him a farmer dressed in rags, unfit to sit among men of title. Laughter rose from a few of the nobles, though most waited to see what would happen. Daniel did not rise to anger. He looked at the Lord and said, "Titles and crowns are not what keep a man alive when storms rise. A man's worth is shown by his deeds, not by the gold on his robe." The words struck like a hammer. The hall fell still again, and the proud lord's face burned with shame. Then he looked down, for they knew in their hearts the truth of what Daniel said. The Queen watched closely, her eyes shining with pride she could not hide. Advisors shifted uneasily. They had told Eleanor again and again that she must choose a husband among the nobles, a man whose name would strengthen her rule. But as she listened to Daniel, she felt the weight of those voices fade. She thought of the countless men who had stood before her throne, speaking only of power. And then she thought of Daniel, who asked for nothing, yet gave everything of himself. The music played on, but the air in the hall had changed. Servants moved more carefully, guests spoke in lower tones. And all eyes returned again and again to the queen and the man who had just silenced them with a single truth. Eleanor's heart beat fast, though her face remained calm. When the meal ended, advisors rose to press the matter of marriage. One after another, they spoke of alliances, of noble families, of ancient traditions that could not be broken. They demanded that the queen give her hand to a man of power, someone worthy by name and by blood. Eleanor listened in silence, her hand resting on the arm of her throne. Then, slowly, she rose. The hall grew quiet at once. Her voice was clear, and every word carried to the farthest wall. You asked me to choose a man for his title? You asked me to marry for land and for gold? But tonight I have seen what worth truly means. Worth is not in crowns. It is not in names. Worth is in honor, in courage, in love that stands even in the darkest hour. The crowd held its breath. Daniel lowered his head, not daring to meet her eyes. The queen looked across the hall, her gaze steady, and then she spoke the words that would be remembered forever. I wish you were my husband, Daniel. The hall froze. Not a sound was heard. The nobles stared in disbelief. The servants stood still with trays in their hands. And Daniel's own breath caught in his throat. He could not move, could not speak. The queen's voice had shaken the very walls of the palace. Some faces showed shock, others anger, and a few awe. The silence lasted long, heavy as stone. Daniel at last bowed his head and said quietly, I am not worthy of such an honor. But the queen stepped forward, her crown catching the light. It is not titles that make a man worthy, she said. It is his deeds, and your deeds speak louder than any crown. The hall remained silent, yet in that silence the kingdom itself began to change. For the first time, the queen had chosen not as a ruler bound by tradition, but as a woman who saw truth in the heart of a man with no name of power. The silence after the queen's words filled the hall like a storm that had stopped in midair. Every face was frozen. Every heart seemed to beat louder than the music that had once played. The queen had spoken not as a ruler bound by her counsel, but as a woman whose heart was clear. Her words shook the very pillars of the palace. The nobles were the first to recover. Anger flared in their eyes, and whispers turned sharp. Some muttered of betrayal, others of madness. To them, the idea that their queen would wish for a common man as her husband was unthinkable, yet none dared to raise their voice against her in that moment. They saw the fire in her eyes, and they knew she would not take back what she had spoken. Daniel stood like stone, could not believe what he had heard. His hands trembled at his sides, though his face remained calm. He bowed again, struggling to find words, but before he could speak further, the queen stepped down from her throne. The hall gasped as she walked toward him, her crown catching the light of the chandeliers above. When she stood before him, she spoke softly, yet the whole room heard. Your worth is greater than any noble here. Do not doubt yourself. Daniel lowered his eyes. I am a servant of my duty. I never thought to stand before you in such a way. And yet you stand, Eleanor said. Her voice carried strength now. And in you I see a man who speaks truth when others hide behind pride. Gasps filled the air. Some nobles clenched their fists, others turned pale. The queen's advisors exchanged looks of fear, knowing the storm that would come from such defiance. Still, no one dared interrupt her. Daniel wished to fade into the shadows, yet he could not move. The queen's words chained him as tightly as they freed him. He could not understand why she chose him, but in her eyes he saw no doubt. That night when the feast ended, the nobles left with heavy steps, whispering of rebellion. In quiet chambers and hidden halls, they began to plot. To them, this choice was not love, it was danger. If the queen broke the old traditions, then their power would fall with them. They swore to stop it, even if it meant treachery. In the days that followed, Eleanor called Daniel to her side more often. They spoke not only of the voyage and the palace, but of dreams for the kingdom. She shared her fears, and he listened. He gave his thoughts without fear, even when they did not please her. She found comfort in his honesty, and the bond between them grew stronger. But the shadows in the palace thickened. Nobles pressed her counsel harder than before, demanding she end this madness. Some began to spread lies about Daniel, calling him ambitious, dangerous, even a traitor. Guards whispered of threats in the night. Through it all, Daniel carried himself as before, plain and steady, though he knew the danger now sat at his very back. One evening, as the sun set over the gardens, Eleanor spoke to him alone. "They will not stop," she said. "They fear you because you have no need of their titles. They fear me because I chose you with my heart." Daniel looked at her. "And let them fear. If I must, I will stand between you and their anger." Her eyes softened. "And that is why they will never understand. They see the throne, you see me." The queen reached out and took his hand. Though the palace walls were heavy with danger, in that moment there was peace. Yet both knew the storm had only begun, and the path ahead would test not just their bond, but the very heart of the kingdom itself. The days after the queen's bold words were filled with unrest. The palace looked calm from the outside, but inside its walls, fear and anger grew. The nobles held secret meetings, whispering of plots to end what they called a danger to the crown. They feared that if a common man could stand beside the queen, their own power would fade. The court was divided and shadows moved in every corner. Daniel felt the weight of those shadows, but he did not run. He continued to walk beside Queen Eleanor when she called for him, and he spoke with the same honesty as before. His calmness gave her strength, but he also knew danger was drawing closer with each passing day. One night, while the queen prepared to meet her council, a loyal guard rushed to Daniel. He warned of a plot. Some nobles had hired men to strike at the queen to remove her before her choice could become law. Daniel's heart pounded, but his voice stayed firm. He asked the guard to lead him to the chamber where the queen was expected to meet her council. The chamber was dimly lit when Daniel entered. He saw Eleanor already seated at the table, and across from her stood men who were not advisors but traitors. Their hands reached for hidden blades, their eyes cold with hate. Without thinking, Daniel stepped forward, placing himself between the queen and the danger. Steel flashed in the candlelight. Daniel fought with no weapon but his own strength. He caught one man's arm and forced the blade away. Another struck at him, and the wound cut deep into his shoulder, but Daniel did not fall. He stood his ground, protecting Eleanor with every breath. Guards rushed in at last, clashing with the traitors, and the chamber filled with shouts and the sound of battle. When it was over, the traitors lay bound, and the queen stood safe. Daniel fell to one knee, blood on his arm, his breath heavy. Eleanor moved to his side at once, her hands trembling as she pressed against his wound. "You have saved me," she whispered, her eyes filled with fear and love. "You have given me more than any crown could ever give." Daniel looked at her, his voice low but steady. "I gave you only what was right. I could not let them harm you." Word of the attempt spread quickly through the palace, and then through the city. The people heard of how Daniel had stood against blades to protect their queen, and their hearts rose with pride. Crowds filled the streets, shouting his name and blessing Eleanor for her choice. The nobles who had plotted were dragged before the people, their power broken. Fear turned against them, and they could no longer hide behind their titles. Eleanor called for a gathering in the great hall. This time, it was not only nobles who stood there, but also common folk, guards and servants. She wished for all to hear her words. She rose before them, her crown gleaming, her voice strong. "You have seen what truth looks like," she said. "You have seen a man with no title stand where others fled. You have seen love and courage greater than any name written in gold. This is the worth I choose for my kingdom. This is the worth I choose for my heart." The hall shook with the sound of voices cheering. People raised their hands, their shouts filling the air with strength. Daniel stood at her side, unsure of his place, but the queen reached for him and pulled him forward. She held his hand before them all, a symbol stronger than any law. The nobles who still resisted saw that their time was over. They could not fight against the will of both the queen and the people. Slowly they bowed, not out of love but out of fear of losing everything. A new path had been made, and they could not turn it back. That night, when the palace grew quiet again, Eleanor and Daniel stood together in the garden. The stars shone above them, and the air was still. Eleanor looked at him, her voice soft but certain. "You changed my world, Daniel. You gave me hope where there was none." Daniel shook his head. "It was not I who changed it. It was you, for you had the courage to see me, not as a servant, but as a man." She smiled, and in that smile was the promise of a kingdom reborn. The palace that once echoed with whispers of fear now stood as the place where truth and love had broken the chains of old power. And though many years would pass, the people would always remember the day their queen chose, not with tradition, but with her heart.